The Akkadian Empire emerged in Mesopotamia during the late 3rd millennium BC, following centuries of political fragmentation among Sumerian city-states in the southern alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. By approximately 2350 BC, the region consisted of independent urban centers such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and Nippur, each governed by local rulers who competed over land, irrigation canals, labor, and access to trade routes. These cities shared cultural and religious traditions, including cuneiform writing, temple-based economies, and polytheistic belief systems, but they lacked durable political unity. Recurrent warfare and shifting alliances defined the political landscape, and no single city had succeeded in establishing lasting dominance over all of southern Mesopotamia. The rise of Akkad is traditionally associated with Sargon of Akkad, whose reign is generally dated to approximately 2334 to 2279 BC, although precise dates vary among scholarly reconstructions. According to later royal inscriptions and king lists, Sargon began his career as an official at the court of the king of Kish before seizing power and founding a new political center, Akkad, whose exact archaeological location remains uncertain but is generally placed in northern Mesopotamia, likely along a major branch of the Euphrates. Unlike earlier Sumerian rulers, Sargon pursued sustained territorial expansion beyond a single city's hinterland. Through a series of military campaigns, he defeated the rulers of southern Mesopotamian cities and incorporated them into a centralized state under his authority. The Akkadian Empire differed structurally from earlier political formations in Mesopotamia. It combined military conquest with administrative integration, placing Akkadian officials and governors in key cities while maintaining existing local institutions where possible. Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the primary language of royal administration alongside Sumerian, which continued to be used in religious and scholarly contexts. This bilingual administrative system reflected both continuity and change, allowing the empire to govern diverse populations across a broad territory extending from the Persian Gulf in the south to parts of northern Mesopotamia and the upper Euphrates in the northwest. Under Sargon and his immediate successors, the empire expanded further through campaigns into regions such as Elam to the east, the Diyala River Valley, and parts of Syria. These campaigns aimed to secure trade routes, raw materials, and political dominance over neighboring polities. Copper, timber, stone, and luxury goods flowed into Mesopotamia through long-distance exchange networks that linked the Akkadian heartland with Anatolia, the Levant, the Iranian plateau, and the Gulf region. Control over these networks strengthened the imperial center but also increased its dependence on sustained military presence and administrative oversight. Following Sargon's death, the empire faced internal revolts and challenges to central authority. His sons, Rimish and Manishtushu, ruled in succession and devoted significant resources to suppressing rebellions in Sumerian cities and peripheral regions. Contemporary inscriptions record repeated uprisings in cities such as Ur, Umma, and Lagash, suggesting that Akkadian control was contested and required continuous enforcement. Military campaigns remained a core function of kingship, and royal legitimacy was closely tied to success in war and the maintenance of order. The empire reached its greatest territorial extent during the reign of Naram-Sin, who ruled approximately from 2254 to 2218 BC. Naram-Sin adopted new ideological strategies to reinforce imperial authority, including the unprecedented practice of presenting himself as a divine ruler. He took the title King of the Four Quarters, signifying universal dominion, and commissioned monuments depicting his victories over mountain peoples such as the Lalubi. These representations emphasized the king's role as a cosmic guarantor of order, linking political power with divine sanction. Administratively, the Akkadian state relied on a combination of provincial governors, military commanders, and temple institutions. Tribute and taxation flowed toward the imperial center, while labor was mobilized for construction, agriculture, and military service. Irrigation agriculture remained the economic foundation of southern Mesopotamia, requiring coordinated maintenance of canals and levees. The effectiveness of imperial administration depended on the ability to manage these systems across diverse ecological zones, from the arid southern plains to the rain-fed regions of the north. Despite its apparent strength under Naram-Sin, the Akkadian Empire exhibited structural vulnerabilities that would become increasingly significant in the decades that followed. The concentration of power in the monarchy, reliance on continuous military campaigns, and integration of culturally diverse regions placed heavy demands on administrative capacity. Internal dissent, evidenced by recurring revolts, indicated that imperial authority was not universally accepted. Additionally, the empire's economy depended on stable agricultural production and long-distance trade, both of which were sensitive to environmental conditions and political disruptions. By the late 23rd century BC, signs of strain began to appear within the imperial system. Later Mesopotamian literary texts, though composed centuries afterward, recall periods of disorder, famine, and social breakdown during the final phase of Akkadian rule. While these accounts must be treated cautiously, they reflect a historical memory of crisis associated with the empire's collapse. Modern scholarship seeks to understand this collapse through archaeological evidence, climate data, administrative texts, and comparative analysis, focusing on the interaction of political, economic, and environmental factors rather than a single cause. This segment establishes the political and administrative foundations of the Akkadian Empire and the conditions under which it achieved regional dominance. These foundations shaped both the empire's achievements and its vulnerabilities, setting the stage for the processes that would ultimately undermine centralized rule in Mesopotamia around 2200 BC. During the later reign of Naram-Sin and the years immediately following his death around 2218 BC, the Akkadian Empire entered a phase marked by growing internal instability and weakening central control. Although Naram-Sin had achieved unprecedented territorial reach and ideological authority, the mechanisms required to sustain such a large empire were fragile. Administrative cohesion depended heavily on the personal authority of the king, the loyalty of provincial governors, and the continuous movement of military forces across distant regions. When these elements weakened or failed, the empire struggled to respond effectively. Evidence from royal inscriptions and administrative records indicates that revolts became more frequent in both the southern Sumerian cities and the northern and eastern peripheries of the empire. Cities such as Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur, which had long traditions of political autonomy, resisted imperial oversight, particularly during periods of succession. These revolts were not isolated events but part of a broader pattern of resistance against Akkadian-appointed officials, taxation demands, and labor obligations. The suppression of rebellions required sustained military campaigns, which placed additional strain on state resources. After Naram-Sin, the throne passed to his son Shar-Kali-Shari, whose reign is generally dated to approximately 2217 to 2193 BC. Shar-Kali-Shari inherited an empire already under pressure and was compelled to devote much of his reign to defensive warfare rather than expansion. Contemporary inscriptions record conflicts with multiple external groups, including the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, the Amorites in the western regions, and Elamite forces to the east. These confrontations suggest that Akkadian control over border regions was weakening, allowing neighboring populations to challenge imperial authority more openly. The Gutians, semi-nomadic groups originating in the Zagros Mountains east of Mesopotamia, appear with increasing frequency in Akkadian sources during this period. Initially depicted as raiders, they gradually became a sustained military threat as imperial defenses deteriorated. The Akkadian state lacked a standing professional army in the modern sense and relied instead on mobilized labor and local forces. As revolts and external threats multiplied, this system struggled to provide consistent security across the empire's vast territory. Internal administrative breakdown compounded these military challenges. The appointment of governors loyal to the central court had been a key strategy under earlier rulers, but during Shar-Kali-Sheri's reign, evidence suggests declining oversight and coordination. Provincial authorities may have prioritized local interests over imperial directives, reducing the flow of tribute and manpower to the center. In southern Mesopotamia, temple institutions regained political influence as central authority weakened, further fragmenting power. Economic pressures intensified alongside political instability. Long-distance trade networks that supplied the Akkadian heartland with essential raw materials such as copper, tin, timber, and stone became increasingly disrupted by insecurity along major routes. As access to these resources declined, the state's ability to equip armies, maintain infrastructure, and support large administrative centers was diminished. In southern Mesopotamia, agricultural production was vulnerable to fluctuations in irrigation management, which depended on coordinated labor and stable governance. Archaeological evidence from several Mesopotamian sites indicates episodes of abandonment, reduced building activity, and declining material wealth during the late Akkadian period. While these patterns varied regionally, they suggest that imperial institutions were no longer able to sustain the level of economic and administrative integration achieved earlier. Written records from this period also decline in number, reflecting reduced bureaucratic activity and possibly the collapse of centralized record-keeping systems. The ideological foundations of Akkadian kingship also came under strain. Naram-Sin's claim to divinity had strengthened royal authority during his lifetime but may have contributed to later resistance, particularly among cities with strong religious traditions centered on local gods. Later Mesopotamian texts portray the final Akkadian kings as having lost divine favor, a retrospective interpretation that reflects how political failure was understood within Mesopotamian cultural frameworks. By the end of Shar-Kali-Sheri's reign, the Akkadian Empire no longer functioned as a coherent centralized state. Control over outlying regions had largely collapsed, internal revolts persisted, and external groups operated with increasing freedom within Mesopotamian territory. The imperial structure, once sustained by military success, administrative integration, and ideological innovation, was now undermined by cumulative political, economic, and military pressures. This period of fragmentation created the conditions in which environmental stress and large-scale social disruption would have particularly severe consequences for the remaining Akkadian institutions. In the decades surrounding 2200 BC, environmental and climatic stress emerged as a critical factor influencing the decline of the Akkadian Empire. Modern scientific research, drawing on archaeological stratigraphy, sediment cores, and paleoclimatic data, indicates that Mesopotamia and much of the Near East experienced a prolonged period of aridification commonly referred to as the 4.2 kiloyear event. This climatic episode, dated approximately between 2200 and 2100 BC, is characterized by reduced precipitation, cooler temperatures in some regions, and increased frequency of drought conditions. While climate change alone does not explain political collapse, it significantly intensified existing structural weaknesses within the Akkadian state. Southern Mesopotamia relied heavily on irrigation agriculture supported by the Tigris and Euphrates river systems. Although these rivers provided a degree of resilience against short-term rainfall variability, sustained reductions in upstream precipitation affected river flow levels and the maintenance of irrigation canals. Lower water availability made it more difficult to support intensive agriculture, particularly barley cultivation, which formed the economic base of Akkadian cities. Salinization of soils, a long-term consequence of irrigation without adequate drainage, further reduced agricultural productivity during this period. In northern Mesopotamia, where agriculture depended more directly on rainfall, the effects of prolonged drought were more immediate and severe. Archaeological surveys in regions such as the Upper Khabur Basin show widespread site abandonment beginning around 2200 BC. Settlements that had previously supported dense populations and surplus production were either reduced in size or entirely deserted. This demographic contraction disrupted the empire's northern grain-producing regions, which had been crucial for supplying food to urban centers and supporting military campaigns. The environmental crisis had cascading economic consequences. Reduced agricultural output led to food shortages, price instability, and increased competition for resources. Administrative texts from the late Akkadian period record irregularities in grain distributions and labor obligations, suggesting that state institutions struggled to meet basic provisioning needs. As food security deteriorated, loyalty to the central authority weakened, and local communities sought alternative forms of organization or protection. Population movements intensified as a response to environmental stress. Groups from arid and semi-arid zones, including pastoral and semi-nomadic communities, migrated toward river valleys and urban centers in search of water and arable land. These movements increased pressure on already strained resources and contributed to social instability. In Akkadian sources, such groups are often labeled collectively as outsiders or enemies, but modern analysis recognizes these migrations as adaptive responses to ecological hardship rather than purely military invasions. The Akkadian state's capacity to manage environmental stress was limited by its political condition. Effective responses to drought, such as large-scale canal maintenance, food redistribution, and coordinated settlement planning, required strong centralized authority and stable administration. By the late 23rd century BC, these mechanisms were already compromised by internal revolts and external conflicts. As a result, the empire was unable to implement measures that might have mitigated the impact of prolonged drought on its population. Archaeological evidence from major urban centers such as Akkad's southern counterparts indicates declining construction activity, reduced maintenance of public works, and shrinking residential areas during this period. In some locations, destruction layers and abrupt abandonment suggest episodes of violence or rapid social breakdown, although these patterns vary widely across regions. The uneven nature of collapse underscores that environmental stress interacted with local political and economic conditions rather than producing uniform outcomes. Later Mesopotamian literary compositions, including laments and historical narratives written centuries after the events, portray the Akkadian collapse as a period of divine punishment marked by famine and chaos. While these texts are not contemporary sources, they preserve cultural memories of hardship associated with environmental failure. Modern scholarship treats them as reflective interpretations rather than direct historical records, emphasizing the need to correlate textual traditions with archaeological and scientific data. By around 2200 BC, the combined effects of prolonged drought, declining agricultural productivity, and population displacement had severely weakened the remaining structures of the Akkadian Empire. Environmental stress did not act in isolation but magnified existing political fragmentation and economic vulnerability. The empire's dependence on surplus production and long-distance coordination made it particularly susceptible to sustained ecological disruption, accelerating the breakdown of centralized authority across Mesopotamia. As environmental stress and internal instability intensified around 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire faced increasing pressure from external groups operating along its borders and within its former territories. Among these groups, the Gutians became the most prominent in both contemporary records and later Mesopotamian historical memory. Originating in the Zagros Mountains to the east of the Tigris River, The Gutians were organized in decentralized tribal formations rather than urban states. Their political structure allowed for flexibility and mobility, which proved advantageous as Akkadian defenses weakened. Akkadian inscriptions from the reigns of Naram-Sin and Shar-Kali-Sheri record repeated military encounters with the Gutians. Initially described as raiders and disruptors of trade routes, the Gutians gradually expanded their influence into lowland Mesopotamia. As imperial garrisons withdrew or collapsed, Gutian groups were able to occupy strategic locations, particularly in northern and central Mesopotamia. Their presence disrupted communication lines between the Akkadian heartland and the remaining provinces, further fragmenting imperial control. The decline of centralized authority meant that the Akkadian state could no longer coordinate large-scale military responses to these incursions. Royal inscriptions from the final phase of Akkadian rule become increasingly sparse and formulaic, suggesting diminished resources and reduced capacity for sustained campaigns. The absence of consistent defense allowed not only the Gutians but also other groups, including Amorite populations from the west and Elamite forces from the east, to assert autonomy or conduct raids with limited resistance. By the time of Shar-Kali-Sheri's death around 2193 BC, the imperial structure had largely disintegrated. The Sumerian king list records a rapid succession of short-lived rulers following his reign, indicating political fragmentation and contested legitimacy. These rulers controlled limited territories, if any, and lacked the administrative reach of earlier Akkadian kings. Central authority over southern Mesopotamian cities had effectively ended, leaving a political vacuum across much of the region. The Gutians capitalized on this vacuum and established a loose form of dominance over parts of Mesopotamia, a period later referred to as Gutian rule. This phase, traditionally dated from approximately 2190 to 2120 BC, is poorly documented due to the scarcity of contemporary administrative texts. Later Sumerian sources portray Gutian rule as chaotic and destructive, emphasizing lawlessness and the neglect of temples and irrigation systems. While these portrayals reflect the perspectives of urban elites, they also indicate a significant decline in centralized governance. Archaeological evidence from this period supports the interpretation of reduced urban activity and administrative collapse. Many cities show signs of diminished population, halted construction, and irregular maintenance of infrastructure. Inscriptions become rare, and standardized record-keeping largely disappears, suggesting that bureaucratic institutions no longer functioned at the imperial level. Local authority structures, where they survived, operated independently rather than as part of a unified state. The Gutians themselves did not establish a centralized empire comparable to the Akkadian state. Their dominance appears to have been episodic and regionally variable, relying on control of key routes and the extraction of resources rather than systematic administration. As a result, political authority in Mesopotamia during this period was highly fragmented, with cities, tribal groups, and local rulers competing for control over land and labor. The combination of external pressure, internal fragmentation, and environmental stress fundamentally altered the political landscape of Mesopotamia. The Akkadian imperial model, based on centralized administration and military integration, had collapsed. In its place emerged a period of decentralization in which no single power exercised effective control over the region. This transitional phase set the conditions for new political formations and administrative experiments that would arise in the following century. In the aftermath of the Akkadian collapse and during the period of Gutian dominance, southern Mesopotamia experienced significant political, economic, and social reorganization. The absence of a strong central authority allowed individual city-states to reassert local control, though under conditions of instability and reduced resources. Cities such as Lagash, Uruk, Ur, and Nippur survived this period with varying degrees of continuity, relying on local elites, temple institutions, and remaining agricultural systems to sustain their populations. Administrative records from the late 3rd millennium BC indicate that temple households became central to economic life during this interval. With imperial taxation and redistribution networks disrupted, temples assumed greater responsibility for managing land, labor, and food storage. Priests and local officials organized agricultural production and religious activities that reinforced community cohesion in the absence of imperial oversight. These institutions provided a degree of stability but lacked the capacity to coordinate large-scale regional infrastructure such as intercity canals or long-distance trade routes. The city of Lagash, located in southern Mesopotamia near the Tigris River, offers one of the clearest examples of localized recovery following the Akkadian collapse. Under the rule of Gudea, who governed approximately between 2144 and 2124 BC, Lagash experienced a period of renewed construction and administrative activity. Gudea's inscriptions emphasized temple building, religious devotion, and economic organization rather than military conquest. His reign illustrates how political authority during this period was grounded in local legitimacy and religious patronage rather than imperial expansion. Despite such localized revivals, broader economic conditions remained constrained. Long-distance trade networks were only partially restored, limiting access to metals, stone, and other non-local resources. Craft production continued at reduced levels, and many urban centers did not regain their former population sizes. Archaeological evidence indicates that some cities remained partially abandoned or shifted toward smaller, more defensible settlement patterns, reflecting ongoing insecurity and resource scarcity. Irrigation systems, essential to agricultural productivity in southern Mesopotamia, suffered from decades of neglect and inconsistent maintenance. Without centralized coordination, canals were maintained on a local basis, leading to uneven water distribution and continued problems with salinization. Agricultural yields remained lower than during the height of the Akkadian Empire, constraining surplus production and limiting the ability of cities to support large non-agricultural populations. Culturally, this period saw the preservation and transformation of Akkadian and Sumerian traditions. Sumerian increasingly reasserted itself as the primary written language of administration and religious texts in the south, while Akkadian continued to be spoken and used in certain contexts. Scribal education persisted, maintaining continuity in legal, economic, and religious documentation despite political fragmentation. These cultural continuities would play a crucial role in later state formation. The decline of Gutian influence toward the end of the 22nd century BC created opportunities for more coordinated political revival. Local rulers increasingly portrayed the Gutians as illegitimate outsiders in their inscriptions, framing their own authority as a restoration of order. This ideological narrative helped justify new efforts at regional consolidation and infrastructure rebuilding. By approximately 2120 BC, conditions in southern Mesopotamia had stabilized sufficiently for emerging powers to attempt broader political integration. The experiences of decentralization, economic contraction, and local governance during this period shaped the strategies of later rulers. Rather than replicating the Akkadian imperial model directly, these rulers drew lessons from its collapse, emphasizing administrative organization, ideological legitimacy, and controlled expansion. This process would culminate in the formation of a new centralized state in southern Mesopotamia. Around 2112 BC, a new phase of political consolidation began in southern Mesopotamia with the establishment of the Third Dynasty of Ur, commonly referred to as the Ur-III state. This development marked a direct response to the instability that followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire and the period of Gutian dominance. The founder of the dynasty, Ur-Nammu, rose to power after defeating the Gutians, an event commemorated in later inscriptions and literary traditions. Ur-Nammu established Ur as the capital of a centralized state that extended its authority across much of southern and central Mesopotamia. The Ur-3 rulers implemented a highly organized administrative system designed to avoid the weaknesses that had undermined Akkadian rule. Authority was centralized but exercised through a dense network of provincial governors, tax officials, and scribes who reported to the royal court. The state maintained detailed written records documenting agricultural production, labor assignments, taxation, and redistribution. Tens of thousands of administrative tablets from this period provide evidence of an unprecedented level of bureaucratic control, reflecting lessons learned from earlier imperial failures. Economic policy under the Ur-3 dynasty emphasized the stabilization of agricultural production and the restoration of irrigation infrastructure. Large-scale canal construction and maintenance projects were organized by the state, relying on corvée labor obligations recorded in administrative texts. Barley remained the primary staple crop, and standardized measurement systems were enforced to regulate rations, wages, and taxes. This degree of economic standardization contrasts with the fragmented and locally variable practices of the post-Akkadian period. Ideologically, Ur-3 kings adopted strategies that balanced innovation with continuity. Unlike Naram-Sin, Ur-3 rulers did not generally claim divinity during their lifetimes, though they emphasized close relationships with major deities such as Nana, the moon god of Ur. Royal inscriptions present the king as a restorer of order, justice, and proper worship, explicitly contrasting their rule with the disorder attributed to Gutian domination. This ideological framing sought to legitimize centralized authority without provoking the resistance associated with earlier claims of divine kingship. The legal reforms of Ur-Nammu further illustrate this approach. The so-called Code of Ur-Nammu, one of the earliest known law codes, established standardized legal procedures and penalties across the state. Although surviving fragments are incomplete, the code reflects an effort to regulate social relations through written law rather than arbitrary royal decree. This emphasis on predictable governance addressed some of the social tensions that had emerged during the late Akkadian period. Militarily, the Ur-3 state maintained a defensive posture focused on securing borders and protecting trade routes rather than pursuing extensive territorial expansion. Garrisons were stationed in strategic locations, and campaigns were conducted primarily to suppress rebellions or deter incursions by neighboring groups such as the Amorites and Elamites. This restrained military strategy reduced the resource burden associated with constant warfare, which had strained the Akkadian Empire. Despite these reforms, the Ur-3 state remained shaped by the legacy of Akkadian collapse. Its administrative complexity required continuous oversight and labor mobilization, creating its own vulnerabilities. The concentration of resources in the hands of the state limited economic flexibility, and regional elites sometimes resisted central control. Nevertheless, for over a century, the Ur-3 dynasty succeeded in re-establishing stability and prosperity across much of Mesopotamia. The emergence of the Ur-3 state demonstrates how the collapse of the Akkadian Empire influenced subsequent political organization. Rather than representing a simple return to earlier city-state autonomy, this period reflects a conscious effort to construct a more resilient form of centralized governance. The successes and limitations of this system would later inform Mesopotamian political thought and administrative practice. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire left a lasting imprint on Mesopotamian historical memory and intellectual tradition. In the centuries following its fall, scribes and scholars preserved accounts of the Akkadian kings and the period of imperial rule through king lists, royal inscriptions, and literary compositions. These texts did not function as neutral historical records, but as interpretive frameworks that explained political success and failure within a moral and religious worldview. The Akkadian collapse was frequently presented as a consequence of disorder, impiety, or the loss of divine favor, reflecting how later societies understood the relationship between governance and cosmic order. One of the most influential textual traditions associated with the Akkadian collapse is the corpus of Sumerian literary laments. Although composed primarily during the Ur-3 and later Old Babylonian periods, these texts describe the destruction or abandonment of major cities and the suffering of their populations. While not direct accounts of Akkadian events, the laments incorporate memories of famine, invasion, and administrative breakdown that align with archaeological evidence from the late 3rd millennium BC. They illustrate how the experience of collapse was integrated into cultural narratives that emphasize the fragility of political order. The Sumerian king list also played a central role in shaping perceptions of Akkadian rule. By presenting the sequence of dynasties as a divinely sanctioned transfer of kingship, the text framed the Akkadian Empire as part of a broader cycle of rise and decline. The brief and often chaotic listing of rulers following the fall of Akkad underscores the perceived breakdown of legitimate authority. This narrative reinforced the idea that centralized power depended on divine approval and moral governance. From an administrative perspective, the Akkadian Empire influenced later state formation by demonstrating both the potential and the risks of large-scale centralization. Subsequent rulers, particularly those of the Ur-3 dynasty, retained many Akkadian innovations, including provincial administration, standardized accounting practices, and the use of Akkadian as a language of record alongside Sumerian. At the same time, they adjusted ideological strategies and administrative controls in response to the failures associated with Akkadian overextension and internal resistance. Archaeologically, the Akkadian period serves as a reference point for identifying systemic collapse in early complex societies. Patterns observed during this time, including urban contraction, site abandonment, declining material culture, and reduced administrative output, have been used in comparative studies of societal resilience and vulnerability. The Akkadian case illustrates how political fragmentation, environmental stress, and economic disruption can interact to produce rapid and widespread change. The collapse also reshaped demographic and settlement patterns across Mesopotamia. The abandonment of northern settlements during the late Akkadian period altered the long-term balance between urban and rural populations. Even after political recovery in the south, many northern regions remained less densely populated for generations. These shifts influenced later political geography and trade routes, contributing to the emergence of new centers of power in subsequent periods. In later Mesopotamian political ideology, Akkad came to represent both imperial achievement and cautionary example. Kings invoked the memory of Sargon and Naram-Sin to legitimize their own ambitions while simultaneously emphasizing their commitment to justice, religious piety, and administrative order. This dual legacy reflects an ongoing engagement with the lessons of Akkadian collapse rather than a simple rejection of imperial rule. By the early 2nd millennium BC, the Akkadian Empire had become a foundational reference in Mesopotamian historical consciousness. Its rise and fall provided a framework for understanding the dynamics of power, governance, and environmental dependence in the ancient Near East. The Akkadian experience informed how later societies conceptualized stability and collapse, shaping political thought long after the empire itself had disappeared. Modern understanding of the collapse of the Akkadian Empire is based on the integration of archaeological evidence, textual analysis, and environmental data, reflecting changes in historical methodology over the past century. Early interpretations, influenced heavily by later Mesopotamian literary traditions, tended to attribute the collapse to moral failure, impiety, or the destructive impact of foreign invasions, particularly by the Gutians. While these factors remain part of the historical picture, Contemporary scholarship emphasizes a multi-causal explanation that situates the Akkadian collapse within broader systemic processes. Archaeological research has played a central role in reassessing the scale and nature of the collapse. Excavations and regional surveys across Mesopotamia have revealed significant variation in how different areas experience decline. Some urban centers show evidence of gradual contraction rather than sudden destruction, while others were abandoned more abruptly. This uneven pattern challenges earlier models of a single catastrophic event and instead points to regionally specific responses shaped by local environmental, economic, and political conditions. Climate science has contributed significantly to this reassessment through the identification of the 4.2 kiloyear event. Paleoclimatic data from lake sediments, speleothems, and marine cores indicate a period of widespread aridification affecting not only Mesopotamia but also regions of the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and South Asia. The Akkadian Empire is now understood as one of several complex societies impacted by this climatic shift. However, comparative analysis shows that climate stress alone did not determine outcomes. Societies with flexible political structures and localized economies were better able to adapt than highly centralized systems like Akkad. Textual evidence from administrative tablets has also reshaped interpretations of the collapse. The sharp decline in written records toward the end of the Akkadian period reflects not only political fragmentation, but also the breakdown of bureaucratic institutions that produced and preserved documentation. This decline complicates efforts to reconstruct events in detail, but also serves as direct evidence of administrative failure. Later texts must therefore be evaluated critically, with attention to their ideological purposes and chronological distance from the events they describe. The Akkadian collapse has become a key case study in broader discussions of state resilience and vulnerability. Scholars emphasize the interaction between environmental stress, economic specialization, and political centralization. The Akkadian Empire's reliance on surplus extraction, long-distance trade, and continuous military enforcement created efficiencies during periods of stability but reduced adaptability during prolonged crisis. When environmental disruption coincided with political instability, the system lacked the redundancy needed to recover quickly. This case has influenced comparative studies of collapse across ancient history, including analyses of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, the Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, and other early state societies. The Akkadian example demonstrates that collapse does not necessarily imply cultural disappearance. Instead, it often involves institutional transformation, population redistribution, and the reorganization of power at different scales. In Mesopotamia, core cultural practices such as writing, religious worship, and urban life persisted despite the failure of imperial governance. The long-term consequences of the Akkadian collapse extended beyond Mesopotamia. Its administrative innovations, ideological experiments, and eventual failure informed political developments throughout the ancient Near East. Later empires adopted aspects of Akkadian governance while seeking to mitigate its weaknesses, particularly by balancing central authority with regional management and by adapting economic systems to environmental constraints. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BC thus represents a pivotal moment in early world history. It marks the end of the first large territorial state in Mesopotamia and provides critical insight into the conditions under which complex societies can both rise and fail. Through interdisciplinary research, the Akkadian experience continues to inform modern understanding of political complexity, environmental interaction, and historical change.